Welcome to the Palestine Exploration Fund. Before I introduce our distinguished guest for this evening, I'd just like to say thank you and recognise the hard work of our volunteers who've set up for this evening. So John, give us a wave. Thank you. Evie, give us a wave. Hannah's out there. She'll give us another wave. And of course, Felicity, thank you so much. It's so lovely to have people back here. And Yasmin as well, of course, who's looking after all of the technology for this evening. So we are having our first in-person talk in a very long time in the Palestine Exploration Fund, and it is appropriately about the city of Jerusalem, which is a city that many of you may know well. Some of you may not know it at all, but you're about to find all about it, because our guest this evening, Andrew Lawler, is going to take us on a journey into the murky world of digging in Jerusalem. Now, Andrew has a starry experience as a journalist, including some work for National Geographic on this very subject. He's also got two previous books on very different subjects, one on the history of the colony in Roanoke, and one, which I am desperate to read, on world history through the chicken. And I'm sure that Andrew will be very happy to talk about this after the show. But without further ado, Andrew, I'd like to welcome you, and I look very much to hearing your thoughts on Jerusalem this evening. Please give him a welcome. Yes, I'm recording.
Well, good evening, and thank you, Michael, and thank you, Felicity. It's a delight to be here. It's definitely coming home because some of the project began, in a sense, here, as well as in Jerusalem. So it's quite lovely to have the opportunity to speak to you all, and I hope that I'm going to tell you something that you don't already know. Felicity, she'll know it all, but we'll see. So let me start by first mentioning this image you're seeing is by a man who's a photographer I worked with in Jerusalem for a couple of years and doing a story. And his name's Simon Norfolk. He might even be here tonight. I think he's trapped on the tube somewhere. But he is an excellent photographer who allowed me to use many of the images that you're going to see this evening. So I just want to give a shout out to him for all of his generosity in letting me use the images. Now, I'm going to start with some basics, and that is about as basic as you can get is, where is Jerusalem? Now, most of you probably know, but I think it's worthwhile to think about the geography of this place because, and I'm hoping that, yes, there we go. Because really, geography is what defines Jerusalem and what makes it such a mysterious place. You see, we're coming down Iraq over here, Egypt over here. We're coming down to the Dead Sea, the Judean highlands, very rugged mountains, kind of in the middle of nowhere, even today. And boom, there we are. There's the old city. This is the Acropolis, the Haram al-Sharif for Muslims, the Temple Mount for Jews. That has been the center of the religious frenzy that is part and parcel of Jerusalem. So one of the questions that I think is worth asking as a journalist, you're always asking the dumb question. Well, why in the heck is Jerusalem such an important place? It doesn't really make sense. There's no port, as you saw. There's no river. There's no really major trade route that goes through this area. And yet, Jerusalem is a city that is as famous as any city in the world. Now, of course, that hinges largely on religion, because you have here the Western Wall that is sacred to Jews. You have, just a matter of a few yards away, the Dome of the Rock at the center of that platform I showed you, which is the third holiest site in Islam. And then, of course, you have the Holy Sepulchre, which is just a 10-minute walk away from these two sites. And it's nice that we're here on Easter week because, of course, this is the site of the traditional tomb of Jesus is located here. We'll talk a little more about the tradition and the archaeology in a moment. So, from the beginning, Jerusalem has been a place that has drawn religious pilgrims, and that's really been its raison d'etre since, well, at least for 3,000 years. But just to give you a little sense of scale, because we tend to forget, Jerusalem looms large in our minds, but in geography, it's quite small. Here's the old city. You could take the old city of Jerusalem and virtually drop it in the reservoir in Central Park and still have a little room left over. So that gives you an idea of the small area that we're talking about that is filled with not just those three major sites, but also hundreds and hundreds of tombs, of sacred sites, of sacred stones, you name it. Jerusalem has it. And it's really unusual in that Jerusalem was formed by water and stone. You have these enormous limestone caves. This is one which now is host to rock concerts, at least in pre-pandemic days. And water flows through limestone and creates all kinds of passages that make Jerusalem a little different from other major cities, ancient cities like, say, Rome or Paris. And up top, you've got these rugged and barren hills, and there's very little timber. And the reason this matters is without timber, you can't build the roof of the house. But you can use stone to build arches. So the city is really based on a series of arches that go back thousands of years. So arches are built on top of arches on top of arches. You've got underneath the quarries that are providing the stone. You've got reservoirs. So all kinds of ways in which the underground of Jerusalem has been utilized for a very, very long time. And again, makes it a little different from most cities that we're familiar with. And just to give you an example, when I was living in the old city, in the Christian quarter, I had a local grocery store that I went to get my things. And one day I went in and the Muslim shopkeeper said, "Who are you? You're not a tourist. You've been here for a long time." It's a little suspicious of me. And I said, "Well, I'm here to study what's underneath the city." And he laughed. He walked over to the potato chip aisle. He lifted the hatch in the floor and vanished down it. And underground, of course, what did I do? I put my groceries down. I followed him, went down this ladder, and suddenly there we were inside a massive medieval cave, really a series of vaulted rooms that went on, I'd say, as large as this entire structure here. I mean, it was astonishing to know that this was beneath my local grocery store. And of course, there was a story behind it, that the Coptic monks who lived next door in the Holy Sepulchre had gained access from the Holy Sepulchre into this space. They dug it out secretly with the help of the Israeli Antiquities Authority, and they worked during the day so that the people above wouldn't hear, because at the time it was a factory. It was very noisy. So it was this whole secret project to expose this ancient, likely Crusader-era hall. Then the question was, who owns it? Because when this guy, actually was his father, when he first heard noise below, he opened up that hatch and he saw a bunch of monks who were actually having a little party down in his basement. And that led to some violence, and the Israelis got involved, and pretty soon you had helicopters flying over Ramallah. There was a fight between Arafat and a new Israeli prime minister named Benjamin Netanyahu, and it became a huge political nightmare. Who owned this space? So that became a whole chapter in my book, and this was just the place that was a 5-minute walk from where I lived in the Christian Quarter. So that gives you an idea of the complexity of what's beneath the city. Okay, so very quickly, I'm going to give you a crash course or a review for most of you on Jerusalem's history. So think of it as 5 millennia. We tend to think of 1 millennia, the biblical millennium. But for 2,000 years before the Israelites arrived, you have Bronze Age peoples, you have Egyptians moving through, you have Canaanites building very large structures, including large walled structures around the spring that is the only source of water near the old city. So around 1000 BC, give or take 100 or 200 years, you have the arrival of the people called the Israelites. They take over, and we call them then kind of Judeans becomes the term. But then over time you have Babylonians and Assyrians and Greeks and Romans, and everybody moving through the Middle East sweeps through Jerusalem at some point. But then everything changes in 70 CE. That's when the Romans, putting down a civil war among various Jewish factions, some of those factions turn against Rome, and Rome obliterates the city. So from that point, we're talking about another 2,000 years of history that go beyond what you would call the biblical millennium. And of course you have the Romans, then you have Persians that come in and invade, then you have the Byzantines, who are basically Christianized Romans, and then the Arabs come in the 7th century bringing Islam, and then of course Crusaders, and then the Ottomans arrive about the same time Luther is putting his theses up on the church door in Wittenberg. So around 1507 or so, the Ottomans take charge and they control Jerusalem for the next 500 years. So there you go, Jerusalem's history in one slide. All right, so this is the part that for me is the most fun, and that is the period between the 1860s and today. So what I was interested in after having toured the archaeological excavations going on today in Jerusalem, which I'll talk about later, is how did it get started? And what I discovered was that it all began not in 3000 or 2000 BC, but it began in the 1860s. It began with this French senator, Félicien de Zozy, who was a confidant of Napoleon III, who's the head of the French Empire. And he managed to get permission from the Ottoman Sultan, who controlled Jerusalem, to dig in the Tomb of the Kings, which is a spectacular site. If you've been to Jerusalem, you may not have been there because it was closed for 10 years for various political reasons. It's now reopened. You can go into it, and it is really a magnificent space that Félicien de Zozy was eager to explore. He was sure he was going to find the treasures of the temple. He was going to find the tombs of David and Solomon. After all, it's called the Tomb of the Kings. Well, he did find this rather plain but important sarcophagus, and it was filled with the bones of what clearly was a royal queen. He pronounced this to be the queen of Hezekiah's queen, so an ancient Judean queen. He hauled this off to the Louvre, and it became a stunning success. It was kind of like the King Tut exhibit that toured in the US in the 1970s. People came by the thousands to see the first biblical artifact that was on view. Now, the Jewish community was quite upset by this, because there was a substantial Jewish community in Jerusalem, and they said, wait a second, these are our tombs, these are our ancestors, you're desecrating our tombs. So there was quite an international outcry by the Jewish community, but politics of the moment, that is the Ottomans wanting to please the French, took precedent. So from the beginning, from this very first dig, you've got politics, you've got religion and science all mixed up together with treasure hunting. What could go wrong? Well, in 1864, and here we're in the heart of the Palestine Exploration Fund right at the moment. But in 1864, the fund sent some very smart British cartographers and miners and military officers to try and get a march on the French. Because the idea that the French were going to fill the Louvre with biblical artifacts did not go over well in London. So at this time, of course, the British and the French were competing to create who could create the biggest empire. So Jerusalem became a focus of this attempt. And people from Queen Victoria to Charles Darwin, everybody wanted to contribute to the Palestine Exploration Fund. And it was a nationalist enterprise as well as a scientific one, and certainly with its religious edge as well. Like, can you pick out who the Anglican bishop is in this picture? Yes, it would be him. And then you have Charles Warren, who we'll talk about a little bit more in a moment. So Warren was this extraordinary explorer, and of course those of you who know something about the fund know that he's one of the founding researchers of the fund. And he explored beneath Jerusalem and did, let's see if we can get that going. Yeah, this was taken actually by a friend of mine just a few months ago. This just gives you a sense of what Warren was exploring, except when he was exploring here, there was about 3 meters of sewage filling this. But there, you get a sense of the enormity of the underground spaces that had been covered up and blocked for centuries, if not millennia. So Warren was exploring, but in doing so, he would have to occasionally use explosives. He actually was underground, close to the Haram al-Sharif, close to the third holiest site in Islam, using gunpowder to blast his way through these tunnels so that he could map what was underneath. Let's see. Now, of course, these gunpowder explosions raised a lot of Arab Muslim fears. So you have the Jews already skeptical of archaeologists. Now you have the Muslims saying, what are these crazy British people doing? I mean, this is our holy site. Imagine if people were setting off charges, close to Westminster Abbey. I mean, it wouldn't go over big here, right? So that's really what was happening in Jerusalem. So there were protests, particularly by a family called the Abu Sauds, who, in my book, I talk a little bit about the legal case that they built to try and have the British government pay for damage caused to their very substantial housing complex right here. There's the Dome of the Rock, there's the Western Wall, and it actually made it as far as the Foreign Secretary, but then it was transferred, then it was given to the PEF to resolve, and the PEF decided, no, we really didn't do any damage, and that was kind of the end of that. But the point is that it really poisoned relations between Arab Muslims in Jerusalem and these Westerners who had come to dig up the biblical past. But it also created tensions between the Ottoman rulers and the locals, because the locals were becoming suspicious that the Ottomans, who were running the show in Jerusalem, were actually not interested in protecting the holy Muslim sites. So it's an appropriate time for us to talk about the Jesus question. And this is one of the big issues that came up in the 1880s, so the early times of the archaeology of Jerusalem. Now the question was, is the tradition true? Was Jesus really, was he crucified? Did he die? And was he buried in what is now the Holy Sepulchre? Well, Queen Helena, who was a mother of Constantine the Great, had determined long before that she believed it in fact was the place. In fact, she found the cross and the nails. Proof positive, right? She was kind of the first archaeologist of Jerusalem. But questions persisted. The problem was this. Those of you who know the Gospels, you'll know that the Gospels say that Jesus was crucified outside the walls and buried outside the walls. That would have been Jewish tradition. And yet, it's sitting kind of toward the center of the old city. So a lot of Protestants said, well, obviously this shows it's just a lot of Catholic or Orthodox hooey. I mean, this is just ridiculous. It really is not, this could not be the true tomb of Jesus. So this was a hot topic because in this time, for the first time, thousands and thousands of particularly Protestants, particularly American and British Protestants, are flooding into Jerusalem. And they want to see the place where Jesus really was buried and crucified and rose again, right? So part of it was sour grapes, because the Holy Sepulchre by that point was already dominated by these older sects like Roman Catholicism, like the Greek Orthodox, and there really wasn't any room for the Protestants, who kind of huffed and puffed and said we wouldn't want to be there anyway because it's just kind of a superstitious place that has no bearing on the true Gospels. So this is where Gordon of Khartoum came to the rescue. You all know Gordon of Khartoum, who died in Khartoum as a kind of Christian British martyr. But he was in Jerusalem on a sabbatical, and he very quickly discovered where the tomb actually was. He believed it was on the north side of the city, outside of the city walls, but on the north end, near the Damascus Gate. And he came up with this really zany, offensive idea that actually the skull, Golgotha, where Jesus was buried, was up here, and Jerusalem was built as a kind of skeleton where the anus was actually where the Dome of the Rock is now. I mean, thereby offending just about everybody in the world. But this was taken up. This was taken up by a lot of well-to-do British women in the 1890s after he died and became a martyr. So the place that he decreed was the site of the crucifixion and the burial became the Garden Tomb, and you can visit it today, and it's exactly like you were taught in Sunday school. It's this beautiful bucolic little garden, which has some old tombs, which of course actually are not first century, but you know, in Jerusalem, facts sometimes just don't get in the way of truth. Now, it was this fascinating guy, I was talking with Michael about him, he's really an interesting character, Conrad Schick. He began as a missionary. He was a cuckoo clock repairman in Jerusalem. I mean, try to make a living doing that. And he became an architect. And while he was doing his architecture, of course, he had to dig foundations. He became fascinated with what was beneath the city. So he's the first person who lived in Jerusalem, who really documented what was underneath the city. And so he became interested in this question. He was a Protestant who believed, like most Protestants, that the Holy Sepulchre was just a superstitious idea that had nothing to do with Jesus. But he teamed up with the Russians, who by that point are becoming very influential in Jerusalem, and they have a dig. It's this interesting dig where a Russian cleric and this German Protestant missionary get together to do science. And they actually came up with a very interesting idea, and that was when they dug just to the east of the Holy Sepulchre, they discovered a wall, a city wall that probably dated to before the 1st century CE. In other words, the Holy Sepulchre indeed did lay outside the walls of Jerusalem at the time of Jesus. So this was really stunning news because it verified, or let's say it supported the tradition that Jesus was both died and buried at the site of the Holy Sepulchre. So that was just an example of how archaeology began to really alter the way we think about the city. It was no longer a place just of religion. Now, by the 1890s, the big question became, what about the city of David? What about the city that David conquered, that Solomon glorified? It was the center of an empire. We've all had some experience in hearing these stories, whether we're Christian or Jewish or Muslim or otherwise. I mean, these are powerful stories that are part of our culture. In fact, Europeans believe that the Tomb of Solomon should be pretty easy to find because it was big, very big indeed. And of course, you had famous objects like the Ark of the Covenant that everyone was eager to get their hands on. But nobody actually knew where the old city, that is the old city, was actually located. So here's the old city in pink. The areas that these two gentlemen, Bliss and Dickey, began to dig were this area called Mount Zion here, and then this little bit of land that stuck out south of the city's Acropolis. Now, I have the expert here. Which one is Bliss and which one is Dickey? They look so similar with their mustaches. Felicity?
I don't know, to be honest with you.
Good, we fooled the expert.
No one's going to tell you you're wrong.
I think that's Bliss, I think.
Do you think this is Bliss?
I think.
Okay. All right, Bliss and Dickey. Well, see, it's hard. I'm glad. I felt embarrassed not being able to say. But if she can't, then who can? So they began to look for the site of ancient Jerusalem. And after digging quite a while, they did find evidence around here of these old pottery that looked like predated Greek and Roman times. So that was a pretty good sign that that was the original settlement. Well, this kicked off a lot of interest around the world, at least in Europe and America. The race was on to find what, of course, you would find in the city of David, the temple treasures. The treasures like the Ark of the Covenant, all the things that had been hidden away when the Babylonians came in 586 BC. So this is really my favorite story of Jerusalem. This British aristocrat, Montague Parker, who was he was a veteran from the Boer War with too much money and too much time on his hands. And he hooked up with this Finnish theologian, or actually a Finnish doctoral student who believed he had cracked the code of Ezekiel in the Bible and therefore was able to tell where the temple treasures had been hidden. So he and Parker get together, and they also team up with, if I get this right, a Swiss psychic, a Scandinavian steamboat captain who worked on the Congo, let's see, a very famous cricket star, and the only thing they were missing was an archaeologist. They kind of forgot to hire the archaeologist. But they did get lots of money from Americans and British people who were eager to find these treasures. So they got something like, I don't know, today's money, a couple $1 million to find the temple treasures, based on the fact that we knew now where the city of David was located. So they began to dig, and for a couple of years they did. And they had a huge retinue. They paid, I think, they had 300 workers at one point. They got the engineer who designed the tube to come and help them dig the tunnels, because the soil under Jerusalem can be quite unstable. So this was a major technological attempt to uncover religious treasures. Well, things kind of went wrong, as you might suspect, and one evening, Parker managed to bribe the head of the Haram al-Sharif, the noble sanctuary, convince him to let the guards go in exchange for a large amount of money. And so he and his team went in and began to dig underneath the Dome of the Rock, underneath one of the most sacred sites in the world. And here's the rock itself, and there's a cave underneath. So they went in at night and began to hack away at the space underneath, because Parker was convinced that this is where the treasure must be. Underneath the Dome of the Rock is where the ancient Israelites had hidden this treasure. But of course, all they had found so far was a bit of pottery, which was no interest to them. And after a few nights of digging, they were discovered, not surprisingly, and they were chased out of town and only barely made it without being killed. And this caused a huge outcry around the world, because there actually were people who believed that they had found the treasure and they had rushed out of town. So you can imagine the locals were furious. Muslims as well as Christians were outraged that these foreigners had come and dug up their treasure and hauled it away under the very noses of the Ottomans. Everybody knew that they probably bribed the Ottomans to allow this to happen. So it was big news around the world. New York Times did big stories, the Washington papers, all over the United States and in Britain. This was headline news. And it was also headlines in places like India and Afghanistan, because Muslims were outraged, completely outraged. That was the time, of course, when India was part of the British Empire. So in London, there was a lot of concern that this could actually spark a mutiny, a revolt, much as like had happened in India in 1857. But another outcome of this, this kind of Keystone Cops operation was that it got Jews in Europe interested in Jerusalem in archaeology for really the first time. And Baron Edmund de Rothschild decided that he didn't want Christians digging up ancient Jewish treasures. So he said, excavations be damned, it's possession that counts. So he funded the first Jewish dig in Jerusalem, and they began to look ostensibly for David's tomb, but everyone knew actually they were just trying to get to the temple treasures before people like Parker could. So this had a big impact on Jerusalem and the world in a way, because it really gave European Jews a new outlook on Jerusalem, a new way of looking at Jerusalem. So you had these American Protestants and British Protestants who've been dominating the archaeology in the area, along with Germans and Russians. And suddenly now you have Jews saying, wait a second, isn't this our Holy Land too? Now, of course, World War I came, and for the next 50 years, there was some digging, but nothing really major, because, of course, the British conquered Jerusalem from the Ottomans in 1917. It becomes part of the British Mandate until the end of World War II, when you get, as a result of the Holocaust, huge numbers of Jews fleeing Europe, arriving in Palestine. 1948, the British say enough, they leave, and the UN creates Israel, and then there's a war. Jerusalem is divided between the Jordanians and the Israelis, with the old city, most of the ancient sites, falling on the Jordanian side, the east side, East Jerusalem. So a very turbulent and violent period in which archaeology kind of takes a back seat. But that changed fundamentally in 1967, when the old city fell during the 6 Days War. It fell to Israeli forces. And that's when Israeli Jewish archaeologists, for the first time, had a chance to really dig into Jerusalem's past. And as always, there was politics and religion involved. And one of the most interesting stories, and this is one I really enjoyed delving into, these two archaeologists, Benjamin Mazar there on the left, and Meir Ben Dov here on the right. They were colleagues. Meir Ben Dov was really the younger colleague. And they began to dig, and of course, Mazar, in digging near the Temple Mount, found evidence of this glorious Jerusalem of the 1st century, BC and CE, that Herod had developed into what was really one of the great tourist draws of the Roman Empire. The Temple Mount was an enormous complex, one of the largest religious complexes in the Eastern Mediterranean. So that we kind of knew, but this was really important news because Israelis were eager to show that Jerusalem and East Jerusalem belonged to them. And here was, in their minds, proof. You see, we were here, we made it glorious, and now we're back. But archaeology doesn't always tell you what you want it to. It doesn't always tell you what you want it to say. And Meyer Ben Dov is a great example of that. You know, he was a Zionist, Jewish archaeologist, and he was digging in this area south of the Temple Mount. And he uncovered this fantastic evidence, this is like 1968, 1969, of these enormous palaces that clearly were built in the early Muslim period, so the 7th century. Why did this matter? Well, the old story among Western historians was that Jerusalem was important religiously to Muslims, but it wasn't really a political capital. It didn't really have a lot of interest for the Muslims beyond just the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque. But this showed that wasn't true. This showed that Jerusalem, for the early Muslims, was in fact an important political center. And one of the early leaders of Islam, in fact, was crowned there. So it really gave a brand new or a fresh view of the complexity of this city. That wasn't just a Jewish city which then had fallen into disrepair. In fact, here was a whole era in which the city was glorified, much as it had been in the 1st century by the Jews. And in fact, I should mention one of the, oops, sorry. I'm going to go back to this. One of the interesting outcomes of this was that when he reported to one of his colleagues that he had found evidence of these palaces, his colleague said, who was a very esteemed Israeli archaeologist, said, "You have a bulldozer?" He said, "Yeah." "Use it. Destroy the evidence. We don't want any Muslim palaces." And Meyer Ben Dov told me this himself. He's still alive. And to his credit, he didn't. In fact, to be sure that the area wasn't bulldozed, he went to the radio station and broadcast live what he had discovered that day. So that gives you a sense of how, you know, a 1,400-year-old palace can cause quite a stir in Jerusalem. Now, really quickly, I want to mention the Rabbinic Tunnel, which, how many of you have been to the Western Wall tunnels? Yeah, a few of you have. So this was a tunnel that was begun as a secret project to dig all the way from the Western Wall all the way along the wall itself, the foundation of the wall, and create a prayer space for Jews. Now, the issue was, this is all the Muslim quarter. They were digging under some very ancient Muslim buildings, medieval Muslim buildings. And so it caused a great deal of tension. And in fact, I'll show you a little bit of, this gives you a sense of the foundation stones of the Western Wall, which are, you know, quite mammoth. And the tunnel runs all the way down. This is about as long as the Empire State Building is high. So it's quite an extensive tunnel. Now, the trouble was when the Israelis decided in the 1990s to open this gate so that tourists could go from the Western Wall and come out, there was trouble. In fact, in 1996, the exit opening sparked riots in which more than 100 people died, thousands were injured, and it really was the beginning of the end of the Oslo peace process. I mean, from this point on, things got bad in Jerusalem and in Israel and Palestine in general. So it gives you I just want you to have a feel for how, as cool as the archaeology is, politics and religion are so interwoven in what's beneath Jerusalem. And even opening a door can create enormous troubles. And that just gives you another little view of part of the tunnel that leads down to the north end. So in the 2000s, archaeologists again went back to the city of David, to that area called Wadi Hilwa for Muslims, that little bit of land that sticks south of the Acropolis. And an archaeologist named Ilat Nazar, who passed away last May, she dug there and she found the remains of, it's in blue here, of a structure that she claims was David's palace. The palace of King David. So finally, after more than a century of digging, archaeologists were claiming, or at least she was claiming, to have found evidence of the early city of David. Because prior to that, there's nothing. There's no building. There's not even a potsherd that could be definitely tied to that period of 1000 or 900 BCE. And that was rather embarrassing to many Israeli politicians who wanted to be able to show that this is the heartland, this is where Jerusalem began, this is where the Jewish culture began at this point. But there was no archaeological evidence. So, 2005, Mazar says, I do believe, I don't know for sure, but I believe that this is the Palace of David. And there was quite a bit of controversy, and there still is, because a lot of her colleagues, in fact, most of her colleagues, Israeli Jewish colleagues, they don't agree. They think that her dating is off. They don't believe that she has the evidence to make this claim. But you know, it's really tempting as an archaeologist in Jerusalem to go from this maybe to this probably is. Because if you want to get attention and funding, then changing may to likely is can have a huge impact on the way people like me in the media report it. So this had a huge, this sent waves around the world. I mean, it's amazing to go back and look at how many articles around the world were written about this find, as if it in fact was true. But in fact, it is still unproven. Now, I mentioned that archaeology sometimes doesn't give you the answer that you might want if you're a patron. And here's a great example of that. So underneath the city of David, underneath the Wadi Hilwa or Silwan neighborhood, the Israelis began, the Israeli Antiquities Authority, began to dig this enormous tunnel. The purpose was to expose this ancient street that ran from the bottom of that hill all the way up to the Temple Mount in the 1st century. So we'd kind of known that there was a street like that, but this was a really ambitious effort to try and expose it. And here's an example of this tunnel. It's like a subway that goes right underneath this almost completely Arab, mostly Muslim neighborhood. And archaeologists like Joe Wiesel, who's here, were digging this as best they could from the archaeologically, let's say, credible way. But still, there are critics who say digging a tunnel is bad archaeology no matter how you do it. You dig down, you've got your layers. You dig through, it's like driving without peripheral vision. You don't know what's on either side of you or above you. So it's been controversial for the way the science is done, but even more controversial the fact that it's underneath, it's a Jewish dig beneath a Muslim part of town that is trying to show a glorious, a street from a glorious period in Jewish history. So there was a little bit of embarrassment among some Israelis when, in fact, it was discovered that the person who probably was the major patron for this street was a man hated by Jews and by Christians alike, Pontius Pilate. So Pontius Pilate was the prefect. He was the guy the Romans put in charge of Jerusalem in that period, in the 30s CE. And because of the coins that popped up that they could find underneath these stones, it was clear, dropped by workmen, they could nail down pretty clearly when this thing was built, at least this portion of the street. And clearly it was not built during the time of Herod or by one of Herod's successors who later ruled. It was built by a Roman with Roman approval. So here you have a Roman who is hated for having disrespected Judaism and for having ordered the crucifixion of Jesus, who was glorifying Jerusalem, building this enormous street that goes up to the Temple Mount. And he probably was modeling it on the Via Sacra in Rome. So this gives us, I think, a little more subtlety in our thinking about Jerusalem in that period, that it's not like the Romans were bad guys, the Monty Python, like Brian, what about the roads? But it clearly shows that the Romans were interested in glorifying Judaism and in keeping people happy at that time. So this was not a discovery that the funders, the City of David Foundation, wanted to hear. And when I went to the opening of this tunnel, I guess it was 2019, It was interesting, during the whole ceremony, they talked about the history, da-da-da. Pontius Pilate's name was never mentioned because it doesn't fit with the current political narrative. Now, here's another dig. I'm just going to mention briefly that, and here's a wonderful picture that Simon took here of the Givati parking lot, which is located just south of the Temple Mount. So here are our Islamic palaces here, the foundations, and with a courtyard in the center, and Al-Aqsa Mosque, of course, and the Dome of the Rock. And here's the Givati parking lot, which is an extraordinary dig because there are a few places in Jerusalem where you can dig down that haven't been built over recently. So it's yielded a lot of interesting information. I'll just say, just briefly, that we have a much richer picture of Jerusalem in the time and periods for which we've known nothing about. That is, particularly the Persian Hellenistic periods, when the Bible likely was written in Jerusalem to a large extent in that time, but we have no archaeological evidence. And what they found was that Jerusalem was not some isolated place up on a hill, and in fact was a place where you have clearly Greek ornaments, you have images, that's Athena, you have all kinds of things you wouldn't think you would find in a culture where human images were taboo. And that just shows that Jerusalem was part of the wider Middle East and that there were traders coming in and out. And then I think it helps us to see Jerusalem in the context of a very tumultuous and richly culturally diverse Middle East. So just to wrap up, and then we're going to have some questions, I'm hoping. The digs below are part of the conflict above. I mean, from the beginning, go back to Dizalzi in 1863. You've got religion, politics, and science, and treasure hunting all mixed up together in this tangled ball that creates all kinds of trouble. That's true today. The players have changed, but what's amazing is how little it has changed. You still have Arabs complaining about their buildings being damaged by people digging below. You still have patrons with strong political and religious agendas. No longer the European and American Protestants, now it's more Israeli Jews. And you also have the continuing conflict over how to interpret data, whether it's where Jesus was buried or whether it's where David's palace was. So what struck me in all of this is that there are few places in the world that have changed so radically as Jerusalem. I mean, think about the wars, think about the way it's been ruled by so many different people in 100 years, yet the same dynamics are still at play that began in the 1860s. So just to leave you with some of the things that were surprising for me, it was really the Western Christians who started all this. It wasn't the Jews and the Muslims. It was Western Christians going to dig up ancient biblical Jerusalem that started us down this road of controversy and of conflict and of contest over who would rule Jerusalem. And still that biblical millennium is what gets the attention. People don't care still for much for what happened during Canaanite times or even Byzantine times. It really is still focused. Journalists and others really want to hear about that time period. For example, you may have heard about a toilet that was found recently, an ancient toilet. Now, who would care about an ancient toilet? I mean, okay, maybe a scholar here and there, but it's in Jerusalem, so it made headlines. So it's still alive and kicking, this fixation or fascination, even obsession with this period, because it's tied up with religion, not so much that it's of interest scientifically. And finally, and this is something I'm happy to hear your thoughts on, as an American, I tend to have a ridiculously optimistic outlook, and I'm desperate. In Jerusalem, I was desperate to come up. Is there any way that this Gordian knot, this geopolitical knot, could ever be untangled? And the best I can come up with is that the science that's being produced, that has been produced for the past 150 years, it gives us surprise. It gives us a new way of seeing the city that lies outside of those traditional narratives, whether it's Jewish, or Christian, or Muslim, or some variation on that theme. And in fact, the science can kind of shake us up. And if we really step back and look at it, we can appreciate Jerusalem not as a place that's owned by one people, but rather a place that is the result of many people's mixing and arguing and fighting and cooperating and coming up with new ways to think about, what is God? Who is God? What does it mean to be human? I mean, these are fundamental questions that are intrinsic to Jerusalem's past, but which I think get lost in the political debate. So with that, I'm going to say thank you in particular to photographer Simon Norfolk. Simon, would you stand up and take a bow, please?
No.
The gentleman back there.
No.
And I'd be happy to take some questions.
Thank you so much. Can we give Andrew a round of applause? So, while we're thinking up questions, Yasmin, is it fair to say you're going to be wandering around with our movable microphone? Now, we've spent a lot of money on this microphone, so I'd like to use it, please. Well, whilst you're thinking up your questions, Andrew, thank you so much for taking us on such a rich journey. I was wondering, is there a particular dig or a particular site that represents your understanding of this story more than others? Is there a particular episode or a particular piece of rock or building that when you think of this story that you've told represents it more than any of the others?
Well, certainly the story of Montague Parker, I keep going back to that story because there's something about what happened there that sparked this fascination with the Ark of the Covenant. Before then, people really weren't, there was no search for the Ark, as far as I can find, before 1900. And it really, what he did there, what that team did, was to spark this particular obsession with recovering this vanished object, which almost certainly was long ago destroyed. It was made of wood, right? It's almost surely gone. But it started this fascination, which of course led to the Hollywood movies, but more importantly, I think, led to this belief that if you just keep digging a little bit harder, you're going to find something wonderful and magical and lucrative beneath the city. And that, I think, is something that haunts the city to this day. In fact, I met with this Jewish rabbi who, along with this Australian arms dealer, they knew exactly where that Ark was, and they were going to pump millions of dollars into digging. And it's like this is still going on. Christian, Jewish, doesn't matter. It's still it's something that got birthed in Jerusalem that I think has been a source of contention and will continue to be for centuries.
Thank you so much.
So listen.
How much?
Wait for the microphone, Felicity.
Oh, sorry.
We can hear you perfectly.
It's for the recording.
How much do you think Jerusalem syndrome plays a part in the archaeology and the exploitation of the archaeology in Jerusalem?
Now, for those of you who are not familiar with the Jerusalem syndrome, Jerusalem is one of the few cities, there are a couple of others, but it's one of the few cities that actually has its own illness. And there's actually a ward where, and I met an archaeologist whose wife works there, for people who come to Jerusalem. They tend to be American Protestants who become obsessed and will put on a bedsheet from the hotel and will go out and preach and believe that they're a biblical figure. It's not common, but it happens. And I think that to a certain extent, everybody who goes to Jerusalem is afflicted by this. I mean, just by going to Jerusalem, it's pulling you there. Why go to this place in a remote part of the world for most of us and walk around in this old city? What is the draw? So I think that syndrome has affected politicians. It certainly affected Bill Clinton. I mean, the Oslo peace talks came about in large part because of his belief that he could bring the peoples of Abraham back together. And Jimmy Carter, you read what Jimmy Carter did when he first went to Jerusalem, wandering the streets in the early mornings, seeing what it would have been like for Jesus. I mean, they're speaking in overtly religious terms, and I think that has really tripped up politicians who are trying, when they do try to solve what's a very difficult political problem, because the religion can actually get in the way. So I think that it's something we all share.
I think something similar happened to William Fox Albright. He started off very sceptical, and it was only when he went to Jerusalem he suddenly began to think, actually, I think that the archaeology of the Holy Land is the archaeology of the Bible.
Right.
And that's when he started to evolve this kind of method, the archaeological ideology or biblical archaeology
Right.
as we know it, the Albrightian school, as it were.
Yeah.
So I think it's really, the psychological effect of this place is embedded in many, many people's way in which they interact with it, even if they don't put it on the bedsheet.
Yeah.
It's there, going on in their head somewhere.
And that's what makes Jerusalem so fascinating. I mean, I avoided the place for 20 years. I mean, I was writing about other parts of the Middle East, but I'm like, oh, no, not Jerusalem. Not that place. But I think that is what gives it so much life, even being such an old city that really doesn't have much in the way of, like old-fashioned tourist things to see. It really has this draw that I think has been true for thousands of years and continues to affect us. Yes, ma'am.
Sure you can hear me.
Just speak loudly.
Oh, okay. I mean, my question is really, to what extent do you think that the Israelis have really won the narrative war as far as archaeology is concerned? I mean, let's be honest, they basically pretty much rule the roost in terms of archaeological, well, you may disagree, but archaeological research in Jerusalem. I went on a tour in the tunnels, under the Haram, where they're proving that the Temple Mount is actually kind of under there. I mean, it's completely absurd, frankly. I mean, you had the whole Israeli side of the story and the kind of praying and the synagogues built under there, and then you go on a tour with an Arab tour leader, and he's just talking a totally different story. It's never been so obvious. But also, if you look in the West Bank, you look in Gaza. I mean, people can't even get it. Archaeologists can't not really get into Gaza now at all. And sites are discovered. I mean, you go around to places like Lid and places like that, and there's the Israeli antiquities signs stuck on these wonderful old buildings of old soap factories and olive oil factories and so on. And it's all just falling into decay. I mean, we've lost, haven't we? I mean, in terms of the other side of the story. I mean, the Israeli control of the story seems to be winning.
Well, I'd say that certainly the people who have the money and the power to dig have the ability to control the narrative. That was true in the 1860s. That's true today. So certainly if you're a Palestinian, you cannot receive a dig permit to dig in Jerusalem. So right there, you're going to get a certain
You can't often even
view
get
of
to Jerusalem,
Sorry?
depending on where you live.
Sorry?
You can't even get to Jerusalem,
Yeah.
depending on where you live.
Right. So it's certainly archaeology, and that's kind of the point I'm making, has always been part of the politics of what's going on in Jerusalem. And today, it's true just as it used to be. Now, I do think that sometimes the science can upset these nice, neat little narratives that are these religious and political narratives. So that's why I do have some hope that someday, over time, people will start to view the place differently because of the finds that are made that show, for example, that Pontius Pilate, maybe we need to rethink our view of him. Maybe we need to rethink our view of the early Muslims in Jerusalem. I mean, these are small things, but I think they can maybe create some cracks in these very stagnant narratives that really aren't telling us anything new. So you don't even have to agree or disagree with the narratives, but I would say that those narratives are incomplete and they don't show us the full picture or even a small portion of the picture of what Jerusalem really is and has been.
But
Yes.
there's an argument amongst archaeologists and some in Israel about the way in which the science of archaeology is being subverted overtly and deliberately to support political ideology. And there are one or two professors in Tel Aviv and in Jerusalem who are beginning to suggest, money, you're quite right, money talks. There's certain organizations that are responsible for getting permits to dig in disputed areas. And it raises the whole question of the way in which archaeology has developed as a legitimate science is now being corrupted by archaeologists in the interest of finance and in the interest of ideology. And that story has never ever been really told yet, it seems to me.
Of course, you're presuming that archaeology at some point was not subverted by politics and religion. And I would argue that in the case of Jerusalem, it has never been the case. So that's just, I'm just saying there's a continuity that we need to understand that is there. So it's very, very difficult. For example, Joe Uziel, who works in the tunnel below, he's moved on to another job for reasons I don't need to go into, but he's a very credible, he's an American, secular, really is interested in the past. He's really not somebody who will spout the Zionist line. If anybody, it's not him. And so he's in this position of being offered a job to dig in what most of the world considers to be occupied territory. In a field where it's really hard to find a job. It's hard to support your family. So the temptation is so great.
Very
so
true.
I'm a little reluctant to judge those Israeli archaeologists who were doing what seemed like good science, or the best science they can do, because they're working in this highly political environment. Maybe they could do it elsewhere. As I say, I don't want to judge that, but certainly I don't think that there's a way that you can take the politics or the religion out of the archaeology of Jerusalem. And I know Rafi Greenberg is an example of a Tel Aviv professor who's spoken out very, very strongly against the digs, particularly in the city of David. But Israel's taken a rightward shift, and so has academia. And Tel Aviv University, which was the real liberal place, they actually are now involved with the Givati dig that is being funded by the City of David Foundation. So you can see even in this place that's considered to be liberal in Israel, they also are now taking part in what's going on in the occupied territory. So I think it just reflects what's going on in Israeli society as a whole. So archaeology is not leading the way, archaeology is just following along with what's going on in the wider society.
Thank you.
Yes?
Not so much a question, more a statement, how I feel maybe about the modern state of Israel. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, the state of Israel is a secular state. But the state of Israel uses religion to hold power over the whole region by controlling Jerusalem. I just think that's very disgusting. I think that's, you said it started with the digs in the 1860s. Surely that stirred up a lot, but really I think big problem of that region stems on the 60-day war in the 1960s when they took over Jerusalem. And I just think it's such a shame because it's obviously such an important archaeological place, and you just can't keep the politics out of it.
You're right. I don't think you can keep the politics out of it. And I think these debates about the ethics of archaeology and what are scientists doing, how do we interpret the data, what are journalists like myself doing in writing about this, and these are all important topics that need to be discussed and not just shoved under the rug. And that's what I'm interested in doing is showing, going back to the history and seeing how did we get to this place, rather than pointing the finger saying, oh, right, this has been going on for a long time. And I also think that as I grew up in an American Christian background, it was really shocking for me to realize the part that my people have played in creating the nightmare that is Jerusalem today. And that's something I think we need to take some responsibility for and know that it's not just about getting Jews and Muslims to live together. It's about those Christians, European and American Christians who were so involved in that part of the world, to understand what we did and how we did it and how we set things up so that we helped to create something that it's part of our responsibility to undo.
I think the people of that, I just add that the people of those sites like Jerusalem happily lived side by side for hundreds of years, if not millennia, until politics came into it. Because you see it in India now, the Muslims and the Hindus in India live very happily side by side.
Well, I don't think we should have rose-colored glasses about Jerusalem because there's always been trouble there.
I'm talking about the inhabitants and the people, the religions. They kind of coexisted side by side, and weren't any deep problems until politics really got into it. I think maybe more from a modern point.
Well, I would defer to Michael to discuss, as our Ottoman expert, to discuss Jerusalem
the
during those.
sunshine and rainbows version of history, I'm sorry to say.
Yeah.
There's been tension, not always religious, but of course plenty of tension, not for modern reasons, but whenever you get people living together that are slightly different from each other, they sometimes live together, they sometimes don't. Felicity has thoughts on this, I'm sure.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I really enjoyed about your book, which was fantastic, was how you focused on the local population of Jerusalem and the impact that the archaeology and the exploration of the archaeology has had on them, and how they have engaged with it, but also how they have been excluded and continue to be excluded from their heritage. And that I found really, really sad, actually. Something that, when we think about archaeology in the UK and public archaeology and the words engagement, community engagement are always at the top of everybody's kind of list of phrases that are being popped out, because people recognise the importance of bringing the local community with you on your journey of discovery. And it seems to me that in Jerusalem the very opposite has been true, that there has been a disconnect, and that is so sad. And is there any way, maybe thinking about how we can mend these wounds that have been made, and to bring that wonderful day of peace, as it were, and the role of archaeology in doing so? Isn't the local community the answer?
I think the answer is yes, of course. But the difficulty in doing that is so, as you know, so tremendous. I mean, at one point, we were at a cafe, Simon and I, and it was owned by a Muslim, and he took us down below, and there's this enormous vaulted Crusader space, and then below that, there's another whole level. And we're like, would you want to have somebody come and dig? And he's like, well, the politics make it very difficult for him to say yes, because they'll be Israelis, and that could cause trouble. And I said, well, what if we got our National Geographic grant, and we have Palestinians as well as Israeli Jewish archaeologists working together? And anybody I would mention that to would just roll my eyes like, oh Lord, sunshine and rainbows again from the Westerner. So I hope someday that can happen, but I don't see it anytime soon. Yes, ma'am.
I just want to speak further on the local community here, which, when you say the Muslims and the Arabs and the Jews, you are jumping over totally the locals. The locals are above any of the religious affiliation. I think, personal opinion.
Well, certainly one of the interesting things I discovered was that Jerusalem before the 1870s was not divided into quarters as we so neatly have today or imagine. That's really a Western idea. People were mixed, living in what we call mixed areas, mixed quarters. So I think there was a lot of diversity, and you didn't have people isolated into their particular boxes.
Exactly. I mean, you have the Mizrahi, for example. They will not accept any digging in the land because they are part of the locals' DNA. But if you have Ashkenazis, like the Russian Jews coming in and they want to dig, they will take part of the locals, the Mizrahis. They will go against the Ashkenazis. The same thing is with the locals that affiliate themselves with the land of Palestine. My DNA is from the same DNA as the soil, or against any Arab that would come from Saudi Arabia living there, or maybe from Pakistan living there.
Well, one of the interesting things
that would be Muslims.
Yeah.
So they will not affiliate themselves to Muslims in that sense, I think, the people of the land.
I was really surprised when I talked to one Palestinian academic, and he said, look, you have to understand that for us, we are our heritage. We don't need to dig to prove. We don't need to dig to find something to say, oh, this is who we were.
Yeah, it's
we
Muslim
know who we are.
foreigners,
And that was true. And that was true for
Jewish
Jews.
foreigners.
That was true for the Sephardic Jews in particular, who had been in Jerusalem for centuries. So it's really, you can move beyond this religious idea and say people who are indigenous or local and live there, they don't necessarily feel like they've got to go searching for their past. It was the Europeans and Americans. This is a Western idea to go and to dig up your past. So that has entered into Jerusalem. And so really, in a sense, the conflict going on began as a conflict between people
Well,
saying,
I feel
you don't
as
need to dig.
I feel the Arab Muslim archaeologists would do the same because they are not really, I mean, the land of Jerusalem and Palestine is not Arabic. They were Arabized when Islam came. So of course the Saudi Arabians or the Qataris or the Emiratis, they have their interest to see what's underneath the Aqsa as well. But that goes against the native. Even though you're from a Muslim family, let's say.
Excuse me. As a Palestinian,
As a Palestinian.
yeah, you don't need to bring in the Saudis and the Qataris. There's the local Palestinian indigenous population that has
This is
been
what
living
we're
there for
saying.
centuries.
This is what we're saying.
Exactly. So, I don't see the point of comparing us to others. Like you said, the Sephardic Jews have been living there for centuries, and they identified as Palestinians at some point until the Zionist project came into being, and that's what ruined everything. Not politics, not religious, not ideology. I think it's the Zionists who ruined everything for Jerusalem, for Palestine, for whatever was going to be of us, Zionism and British colonialism.
Yeah, I would love to live on that idea that my parents and your parents, their generation, picked up. But we still had 500 years under the oppression of the Turks. So we had an issue anyway before that.
Of course. But
And we tend not to talk about it, but there was a big problem.
This sounds like
Turks,
a really
500
great
years.
debate to have over
I
cemetery.
agree.
Really? No, I don't want to suppress that debate. I hope that you will stay and keep the conversation going, because that is the point. But I wanted to, Simon
I was
had
just
raised
saying, I
his
know
hand.
you've been there recently, but I was just, when I was there, I was amazed that the pilgrims that were there were not British and French, they were Korean Catholics, they were Nigerian Pentecostalists, and I know that you were talking about Ella Mazar, and I was amazed that she was funded by a Bible school in Oklahoma or something like that. And I just wondered if recently you've seen any new kind of players on the archaeological scene. Is there any sign of money coming from Saudi Arabia, or
No,
money coming from
the new
Nigeria,
player
or
that
money coming from Malaysia, or something
The
like
new
that?
player that I keep hearing about is Turkey.
Ah.
Speaking of the Ottomans, that the Turks have they're investing a lot in Jerusalem, and in fact that cafe that I mentioned earlier had been the Turkish government had come in and helped fund the cafe, so we didn't have to close or sell to Israelis, and there were even waiters who were Turkish there.
Wow.
So yeah, I think the more things change, the more they stay the same in Jerusalem. You have these players that come and go, but they're never always gone. And the Turks are back, and they have quite a presence.
And on that bombshell, I think that we should probably take the discussion to our refreshments. But first of all, I'd like to thank you all for the high quality of the questions and contributions that set the bar very high for future discussions. But I'd especially like to thank Andrew for giving us such a stimulating discussion. So can we thank him again?